Social music talk. You know, sound bites, that's what mainstream media is about usually. But on podcasts, online, we actually go deeper. We actually can talk an hour or as long as we want, really, about whatever we want. And today I want to talk about a radio pro from Northern California. I've known him since early 90s when I was at Quad in Sacramento. He came from Southern California, in fact, San Diego. A man who is on the air now in Vacaville doing mornings at KUIC.
Yeah?
It is John Young celebrating his 20th anniversary.
Hey, congratulations to John Young, man. That's
John,
awesome.
how you doing?
You guys are very sweet. Thank you. I'm doing well. That was a very sweet introduction, AC. You're right. We go back. It's coming up on 30 years, literally, when we first ran into each other in Sacramento.
Yeah. I mean, your band was Mature Innocence at the time, right?
Even though we were immature as human beings, we were mature innocence. That was the band's name. And again, I got to give you credit for those in the audience who don't know. You're one of those program directors and on-air personalities who was very keen to break new bands in and was very supportive of new music and alternative music. And you fostered one of those local music shows on Quad that gave a band like ours, Mature Innocence, a chance to actually get out to an audience. And we've always been real appreciative of the shot in the arm you gave the band back in the day.
Well, thank you, John. It's always been a pleasure to know you and to even jam with you. We've been on stage before together.
That's true. If you go back to some of the scary club gigs that when you were writing new music and working as a solo artist, and because I was able to play sort of multiple instruments, I would often get gigs in your band if you needed a drummer, or you needed another guitar player or something, and I got a chance to try out some of those new songs that you would, as you were writing them and developing them for a live audience. It was fun to be a part of that.
Yeah, that was really fun. It was a really fun time for a lot of bands back, like local bands back then. And
as I reflect on that time, it makes me reminisce for that when you had program directors or stakeholders in the radio business who were willing to take a chance on unsigned bands, or at least carve out part of the radio schedule for those bands. You just don't see that much of that anymore, whether it's Northern California or San Diego or Iowa or New York City. It's harder and harder to find those slots.
Yeah, we had this show, The Sound of Sacramento, and we were playing Deftones and Cake before they were signed.
That's what I'm talking about, man. I mean, and oftentimes you find, not that Mature Innocence was one of these, but you often will find a nugget in those unsigned bands and give them a chance to expose their music to a bigger audience and ultimately to be able to have a career based on creating that kind of art. And again, we give you a lot of credit, Alex Cosper, for being one of those people. And there's some other folks out there that do that, but you had to be a little visionary and sort of fight some of the more commercial trends, and you were always willing to do that. So that's kind of made our friendship what it is over almost the last 30 years.
Well, thank you, John. That is actually I appreciate that, but it's also very true, everything you've said, because I did have a vision for radio to return to its roots of being local based. The big corporations have been involved with radio since its beginning in the 20s, but there have always also been a lot of independent small stations like where you're working. Tell us about the company you work for.
Sure, that's a good question, because I knew you would, when a lot of folks are, especially people who are in the industry, are listening to this today and saying, what is this dude making a big deal about being in it for 20 years? I've been doing it for 40 years, or I've been, what 20 years is nothing. But
I was in it 22 years. However, 3 of those years I wasn't in it, so 19. You beat me.
Well, listen, but what you did and what I did, although there's certainly some cross-pollination and some similarities, and I learned a lot from you because you were in it earlier than I was, but what I feel like is more important and significant about my 20 years is I've been actually doing morning radio for about 22 years. I spent 2 years in Sacramento proper on the old Cool 101.1. You'll remember the old oldie station.
I listened to them a lot starting in the early 80s.
Yeah, and I was fortunate enough to get a gig on there, literally writing song parodies the night before I would go on. I had 1 day a week that I would show up and I would bring my acoustic guitar, the one you remember very well. I'd show up there.
And I'd remember you on the air.
Play, yeah, I would play live song parodies. And so I did that for literally 2 years, trying to establish some kind of a career, trying to get some traction. I had a lot of fun, but I didn't make any money, and I didn't really have any traction. And ultimately, I got the gig at KUIC, the one you referred to, on November 1st of 1999. And what I think I'm more proud of than anything is I've been able to stay in the morning drive slot for 20 years. That's where you know as well as anybody.
Out of the millions of Americans, how many? 323 million? A very small percentage get to ever be on the radio, period. And then out of that group, there's a very small percentage that gets to do a morning show. And then there's a smaller percentage of those who do it for 20 years.
So, and as I reflect back, part of that is wonderful, and I'm proud of it, and I certainly am grateful to not only to the company for keeping me employed, but for the audience and the community that has backed me up and has supported me since late 1999. But I also missed out on a lot of the things that you were a big part of. I mean, you came into radio and had multiple experiences, not just as an on-air personality, and you were a great one, you still are, but you also were a program director. You also were a music director. You also worked with the artists that would come through town, and you had to set all that up, and Wine and Dine Cake and Missing Persons and Live and Nirvana. I mean, you were part of that. I've always just been on the other end of a telephone interviewing those people. I didn't get to help break their records and break some of their singles, and in that regard, that's where I think I've had to turn to some of my mentors like you and some of the other folks in Sacramento, Tony Cox, some of those other guys who've been around a long time.
Tony's great. He's my mentor. Tony was my original mentor.
Yeah, we've had a lot of them, and you've helped. You've always been good about working with people who are just new to the business, who may have a propensity or a proclivity or a talent to talk, but some of the other inner workings of radio, the business angle of it. I mean, I'm sure you've shared with your audience, but for those of you who don't know, Alex Cosper had to put up with a lot of crazy ownership and negotiating bizarre deals with guys who were really in the cosmos when it came to running things in Sacramento. And you've got some experiences that literally 0.000% of the radio industry will ever have. Because
that was pure independent radio, independently owned by a sole proprietor who ended up in court a lot.
I know. Hopefully, my wife just came home.
Okay.
Hi, Alex. You remember Meg? Another
Meg.
thing I'm really proud of.
Yeah, Meg.
So he says, "Hey, honey."
I remember
the fact that
we'd see shows together like in the 90s.
Yep, she sang backup on one of the albums that you and I both worked on. She was one of that, and you were in that too. I had a chorus of people shouting in the background, and Meg and a couple of other colleagues from the industry around that. So she's got some recording time in the saddle too. So
yeah. Well, we'll talk. I want to talk
awesome.
About your songwriting and your music and your current band in about 10 minutes or something. But I also want to talk about your radio gig right now. Tell us about KUIC and working there doing mornings.
Well, and I appreciate the question. You had asked me about what is it like to work for the company we work for, and the radio station did start off as a owned by two brothers out of San Jose, whose father had been instrumental in some of the first radio stations that were ever built in the Bay Area back in the mid to late 20s. Two brothers named John and Jim Levitt.
Wow.
And so they sold the company. So for the majority of my time as the morning show guy at KUIC, they were the owners, and they owned two other stations in the Bay Area in addition to KUIC. But in 2015, the station was bought out by Alpha Media, who you may be familiar with. They're buying up stations right and left.
Yeah, I've heard.
And there was some fear when they bought the station that they would, clean house. They would come in and, get rid of everybody, including the morning guy, me, who'd been there for a million years.
Yeah.
And it turns out, just speaking to just what you said a minute or two ago, Alpha Media was impressed with our concept of having a radio station that served the local community, that cared about the area that, the coverage map that we broadcast to. And they left everything alone for the most part. I mean, there was a couple changes here and there, but for the most part, they left the air staff alone. They left our formatting alone. They left our commitment to local, live and local, they call it. mainly because they felt like with the competition now with, with Spotify and Pandora and digital platforms and whatnot, that we could do something as a local radio station that some of those bigger conglomerates couldn't do, which is speak directly to the community we serve. And that's been a real plus and a real bonus to being involved with Alpha Media up to this point.
And in that sense, like what are things you do that are local that like a big national chain can't do?
Well, one of the things we can do is we can actually tell you who won the Dixon High School versus Vacaville High softball game that afternoon.
All
we
right.
can tell you when the power went out in Northern California and PG&E, the shutdowns were happening, and they may have affected you guys there too.
No, it's not affecting us, but I'm just curious. Is it affecting you at this moment? The blackouts?
No, it's luckily because I live in Roseville. Meg and I still live in Roseville in the same house you remember.
Yeah.
We bought 1 million years ago.
Right. With
we
the
have
backyard.
Our power company. With the backyard that is great for partying. You're right.
Wow.
We'll have to get into those stories later because those are legendary. But the reality of having a local radio station when the power went out, we became the source the community went to find out when is the power coming back on. Mm-hmm. If I've got a country home somewhere and my well is on an electric system so I can't pump water, where can I get fresh water? Where can I plug in my phone or my laptop so I can get the latest information? And we became the emergency go-to for Solano and Yolo and Napa counties and Contra Costa and some, and West Sac and places like that. So,
doesn't KUIC get into the San Francisco Nielsen ratings?
Yeah, they do, and they also we're split between those and the Sacramento area one. So we're in a really interesting geographic position that kind of serves all the areas between those two major metros.
That is awesome coverage.
Yeah, it really has been. Again, I've been very fortunate, even though I'm not from that area and I don't even live in that area. I live up in Placer County, as you well know, above Sacramento. But
are you calling from Placer right now?
I am calling from the Roseville, from my bright purple office where I have my guitars and my the instrumentation, and where I do work when I'm not in the studio. So yeah, I call it the purple office, the purple room.
Cool.
The locality, and what we can do that bigger radio stations can't do is speak directly to communities that are affected directly by things like power outages and the fires in Napa 2 years ago, and those types of big events. We're the go-to place for people in the community, and that's created a bond that I don't remember growing up, in the San Diego area, having a station that was that close to my own neighborhood, and that's kind of how it feels to work at KUIC.
And then in Vacaville, how many stations originate from Vacaville?
We're the only one. We're the only licensed FM in Solano County, which of course covers Vacaville and Fairfield and Vallejo and Dixon and Davis, where UC Davis is. And just a little bit of interesting trivia you might like, AC, because you love history and you love trivia. But it occurs to me as I get close to this 20-year anniversary, 2 weeks from now or so, is that the station got licensed in 1973. So it's been on the air since 1973. If I'm doing the math, I think that's 46 years. 20 of those years, I've been the morning person. I mean, I keep thinking, these poor people, I've got 3 generations now of people who've grown up in those areas and like, is that guy still on the air? What is he doing? He's been on here since I've been in kindergarten, and now I've got 3 kids and a mortgage. And if that guy's still doing the show, so
that's
it's
awesome.
humbling.